Hello, I'm Damian Radcliffe, the Caroline S. Chambers Professor of Journalism at the University of Oregon and the lead author of the New Media Academy's new study on how the Middle East used social media in 2020. Over the course of the next 10 minutes or so, I'm going to talk you through some of the key findings from that report, which I hope you'll find useful and interesting. Let's start by talking about the rationale behind the report. Why have we produced this? Well, the most important reason for this is obviously the fact that it's been an incredibly turbulent year. The COVID pandemic has kind of really created a whole sort of new world order, and that's impacted on all aspects of our lives, including the way in which we have used social media. We're also very cognizant of the fact that decision makers, from businesses to government to content creators, also need a really up-to-date evidence base on which to make decisions about the way in which they spend their time on social and the kind of strategies that they deploy. And finding up-to-date research can be really hard. So that was a gap that we wanted to try and fill. I'm going to talk you through some of the kind of key statistics in terms of how the Middle East uses social media. And then I'll talk a little bit more about shifting behaviors, how businesses are adopting social, and the impact of COVID on social media behaviors. Let's start with some of those key statistics. Well, the first thing I wanted to point out is the fact that the Middle East is a real world leader when it comes to social media consumption. Research shows that users across the wider Middle East and Africa region are on social media for an average of 3.5 hours a day. And that's a huge amount of time. And of course, that's also an average figure. So that means some people are using that less and some people even more. 3.5 hours is a huge amount of time. And for businesses, for content creators, for government agencies, we need to get where the eyeballs are. And increasingly, that is on social. It's also on a wide variety of different platforms, with users on average having more than 8 different social media accounts that they actively use. And that's highest in UAE, in fact, the highest in the world, where the average social media user, and again, that's an average, so some people will be even more than that, have 10.5 different social media accounts. Now, we're going to talk about some of the newer platforms, and there's always a lot of excitement and interest around them, but we shouldn't forget that traditional kind of well-established social media platforms also continue to be incredibly important. Facebook for some time now has had more than 2 billion users around the world, and it continues to be a platform which has considerable reach across the Middle East, both on a kind of country by country basis, and also in terms of some of the most populous countries in the region being among some of the biggest markets for Facebook anywhere around the world. So Egypt has 44 million users, and Turkey not far behind with 37. And when we look at where Facebook is growing the fastest, it's really interesting to see that in the top 10 markets where it's growing fastest, 3 of those countries can be found in North Africa, and they're Egypt, Morocco, and Algeria. So Facebook is far from dead and remains incredibly important as a platform for social media users, particularly in North Africa. Similarly, Twitter has seen over the course of the last few years, across the region, that usage has declined, but not everywhere. And it still has a really significant role to play in some of the largest markets in the region, particularly Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt, which are among the 20 biggest markets in the world for that platform. Because people in the Middle East spend a lot of time on social media, it's perhaps not surprising that they have a lot of trust in those networks or the kind of companies behind them. So when research was undertaken to understand kind of which brands people trusted the most in some of the biggest markets in the Middle East and North Africa, typically they tended to be kind of national or kind of local brands that were the most popular. Very few kind of international brands permeated and kind of punched through. The exception was often social media platforms and tech companies based out of Silicon Valley. So the likes of Google, WhatsApp, YouTube, but also kind of Instagram and others score very, very highly in these kind of big markets in MENA. And in terms of why people use social networks, well, I think we often assume that it's for kind of entertainment or kind of news and information purposes. And that's certainly true. But we also need to understand that people use social networks for a wide variety of different reasons. And increasingly, they're also using social networks as a way to research brands to look at reviews and opinions, but also to find out about kind of the brands themselves. And that kind of affinity and kind of relationship with the brand can go beyond just kind of interaction in the online space. It can also manifest itself in terms of purchase decisions, either online or in the real world. So the way in which brands are being researched online is a really interesting trend that people need to be aware of. And it's one where a number of countries across the Middle East and North Africa are really taking the lead. In terms of shifting behaviors, there's a few things that kind of caught our eye over the course of the past year or so, and also kind of looking back at kind of longer term trends, which I think is also a significant part of this piece. One of the most obvious manifestations of that was the way in which social media is increasingly a go-to source for news for Arab youth. So amongst young people across the region aged 18 to 24, nearly 8 in 10 now say they get their news from social media, and it is by some margin the most successful or more popular media platform ahead of television, online channels, and newspapers. And that's been the case for the last couple of years. But what's really interesting here is, go back 5 or 6 years, and it was only a quarter of Arab youth who said they were getting their news from social. So we've gone from 25% to 79% in just 6 years, which I think is a phenomenal transformation, and one that news brands in particular really need to be aware of. Last year saw a lot of excitement about TikTok, perhaps partly pandemic related, that at a time of considerable challenge for pretty much everybody around the world, we needed kind of distractions from lockdowns and quarantines, and TikTok was kind of a perfect platform potentially to be able to kind of enjoy kind of snack size entertainment. And in the GCC, what we saw was that a number of the kind of biggest influencers on the TikTok platform really grew their reach and their impact and their engagement levels during the early stages of the pandemic, quite rapidly. And what's particularly interesting, I think, when you look at TikTok, is that it's not necessarily kind of traditional, well-known influencers on other platforms like YouTube or Instagram and elsewhere, Snapchat, for example, who have successfully migrated onto the TikTok platform. There's a whole new generation of influencers that are native to TikTok that are really starting to make a name for themselves. Snapchat has been around for a little bit longer than TikTok, still a relatively new platform, and still one that is really important, particularly in the context of the Middle East. It's really interesting when you to see that, in terms of the 15 biggest markets for Snapchat anywhere in the world, 4 of those, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Iraq, and Egypt, can be seen in the Middle East and North Africa. Reach continues to grow, at a pretty decent clip. So up 38% in the region year on year by October last year. And in particular within Saudi Arabia and UAE, really influential as a platform, but for all sorts of different engagement, including consuming content on Snapchat Discover, where numbers have been up 50% year on year. What about businesses? How are businesses embracing some of the trends and changes that we're seeing in social media? Well, one of the things that I thought was really interesting and really caught my eye was the way in which chat apps and kind of messaging applications are increasingly being used by businesses for consumer relationships. So they're kind of getting active on Facebook Messenger and on WhatsApp, and having kind of traditional customer service relationships, the kind of thing that you used to have to do kind of over the phone on a telephone call. Those conversations are now migrating into the kinds of places where we're chatting with our friends and our family and our colleagues, and we're having that same style of conversation, but with brands and with businesses around kind of consumer transactions, or to find out more about brands. And that's become increasingly easy to do, as there's a whole variety of new tools and software that can be used to have those kind of conversational relationships. And that's a trend that I expect we're going to see even more of. So expect more businesses to be migrating into this space, and if they're not already, to be certainly looking at how they can do so. The pandemic shaped, a whole variety of our different behaviors, one of which was the boost that it gave to online shopping and e-commerce because we were stuck at home. We couldn't go out and buy things in the way that perhaps we might have done in the past. And that's been really challenging, particularly for small and medium-sized businesses, many of whom in the region haven't necessarily had a large digital footprint. And the pandemic forced this kind of digital transformation that arguably needed to happen anyway, and now it's happened. There's no going back from it. And what we've seen is that as a result of embracing the opportunities that digital provides, forced by the pandemic and COVID-19 to do so, that a number of small and medium-sized businesses, a sizable number of them, 1 in 4, have seen increases in digital sales. And again, I expect that they'll probably do more of that over the course of the coming year. TikTok's as a platform, has done more than just kind of influence the kinds of engagement that we might have kind of for entertainment purposes, the kinds of influences that we have seen. It's also increasingly a platform where people might be looking at content that relates to brands or products, and because it's kind of portrayed in a kind of interesting, engaging, and kind of fun light, it might be make them more likely to purchase products that they've seen kind of referenced there. And again, that's an area where the Middle East is kind of really leading the way. And then what about that kind of wider impact of COVID? Well, we talked a little bit about some of the trends that we've seen in terms of the rise of TikTok, people spending more time on social media. We saw that on Snapchat, some of the statistics that were presented on screen there, but kind of more generally, we also saw that people were spending more time on social media during the pandemic, particularly during the early phases. And here's some data which kind of shows you that. So at the start of last year in the Middle East and Africa, people were spending around about 3.5 hours a day online. But jump ahead to May, and that number had increased by 57%, or 57% of people were saying they were spending more time on social media, more than half of people, as a result of COVID. The importance of this as a channel for communicating with the public about public health messages has been huge. We've seen NGOs like the WHO, UNICEF, UNPD, and others, as well as government ministries, using social media and social platforms as a way to engage with the public and try and reach people where they are. And that, to some extent, represents kind of like a big shift away from perhaps a lot of traditional media advertising or even traditional digital media advertising, to trying to find kind of new, interesting, creative, and engaging ways to get into the spaces and places where people are spending their time. And increasingly, that's on social media. So if you want to reach people with key messages, you have to have social as a key part of your content and promotion mix. And alongside that, we've also seen the emergence of a number of other issues and challenges. We've heard talk of something called an infodemic, which kind of references the sheer volume of misinformation, which has often been found online during the course of the past year related to the novel coronavirus. And that's created a number of different opportunities. So public health agencies have been partnering with social networks, so they're not just kind of creating opportunities to run campaigns online. They're also increasingly partnering with the likes of TikTok, YouTube, and others to communicate messages and kind of get into people's feeds. They've also been working to try and ensure that misinformation is taken down and isn't more widely spread. And that's created opportunities for civil society groups in particular to also play a really important role in terms of fact-checking, debunking misinformation, and pointing people towards accurate sources. And because there's often a lot of unease or perhaps mistrust in some information sources, there's also been a recognition of the fact that influencers, people who have relationships with consumers on these platforms, can also play a really, really important role in terms of helping to communicate messages accurately to the public as it relates to COVID-19. And so we've also seen a lot of partnerships between government agencies and indeed platforms themselves with key influencers as a way to communicate really important, potentially life-saving information as it relates to the pandemic. So that's just a quick walkthrough of some of the key things that really stood out for me as we put together this report over the past few months. If you want to find out more information, please go to the New Media Academy's website, where you can download for free our extensive report in English and Arabic looking at how the Middle East used social media during 2020.